Fromm's methods of investigation. Fromm gathered data on human personality from many sources, including psychotherapy, cultural anthropology, and psychohistory. In this section, we look briefly at his anthropological study of life in a Mexican village and his psychobiographical analysis of Adolf Hitler. Social character in a Mexican village. Beginning in the late 1950s and extending into the mid-1960s, Fromm and a group of psychologists, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, physicians, and statisticians studied social character in Chiconcuic, a Mexican village about 50 miles south of Mexico City. The team interviewed every adult and half the children in this isolated farming village of 162 households and about 800 inhabitants. The people of the village were mostly farmers, earning a living from small plots of fertile land. As Fromm and Michael Maccoby described them, they are selfish, suspicious of each other's motives, pessimistic about the future, and fatalistic. Many appear submissive and self-deprecatory, although they have the potential for rebelliousness and revolution. They feel inferior to city people, more stupid, and less cultured. There is an overwhelming feeling of powerlessness to influence either nature or the industrial machine that bears down on them. Could one expect to find Fromm's character orientations in such a society? After living among the villagers and gaining their acceptance, the research team employed an assortment of techniques designed to answer this and other questions. Included among the research tools were extensive interviews, dream reports, detailed questionnaires, and two projective techniques: the Rorschach ink blot test and the thematic apperception test. Fromm believed that the marketing character was a product of modern commerce and that it is most likely to exist in societies where trade is no longer personal and where people regard themselves as commodities. Not surprisingly, the research team found that the marketing orientation did not exist among these peasant villagers. However, the researchers did find evidence for several other character types, the most common of which was the non-productive receptive type. People of this orientation tended to look up to others and devoted much energy in trying to please those whom they regarded as superiors. On paydays, working men who belonged to this type would accept their pay in servile fashion, as if somehow they had not earned it. The second most frequently found personality type was the productive hoarding character. People of this type were hard-working, productive, and independent. They usually farmed their own plot of land and relied on saving part of each crop for seed and for food in the event of a future crop failure. Hoarding, rather than consuming, was essential to their lives. The non-productive exploitative personality was identified as a third character orientation. Men of this type were most likely to get into knife or pistol fights, whereas the women tended to be malicious gossip mongers. Only about 10% of the population were predominantly exploitative, a surprisingly small percentage considering the extreme poverty of the village. An even smaller number of inhabitants were described as productive exploitative, no more than 15 individuals in the whole village. Among them were the richest and most powerful men in the village, men who had accumulated capital by taking advantage of new agricultural technology as well as a recent increase in tourism. They had also taken advantage of the non-productive receptive villagers by keeping them economically dependent. In general, Fromm and Maccoby reported a remarkable similarity between character orientations in this Mexican village and the theoretical orientations Fromm had suggested some years earlier. This anthropological study, of course, cannot be considered a confirmation of Fromm's theory. As one of the study's principal investigators, Fromm may simply have found what he had expected to find: a psychohistorical study of Hitler. Following Freud, Fromm examined historical documents in order to sketch a psychological portrait of a prominent person, a technique called psychohistory or psychobiography. The subject of Fromm's most complete psychobiographical study was Freud, but Fromm also wrote at length on the life of Adolf Hitler. Fromm regarded Hitler as the world's most conspicuous example of a person with the syndrome of decay, possessing a combination of necrophilia, malignant narcissism, and incestuous symbiosis. Hitler displayed all three pathological disorders. He was attracted to death and destruction, narrowly focused on self-interests, and driven by an incestuous devotion to the Germanic race, being fanatically dedicated to preventing its blood from being polluted by Jews and other non-Aryans. Unlike some psychoanalysts who look only to early childhood for clues to adult personality, Fromm believed that each stage of development is important and that nothing in Hitler's early life bent him inevitably toward the syndrome of decay. As a child, Hitler was somewhat spoiled by his mother, but her indulgence did not cause his later pathology. It did, however, foster narcissistic feelings of self-importance. Hitler's mother never became to him a person to whom he was lovingly or tenderly attached. She was a symbol of the protecting and admiring goddesses, but also of the goddess of death and chaos. Hitler was an above-average student in elementary school, but a failure in high school. During adolescence, he experienced some conflict with his father, who wanted him to be more responsible and to take a reliable civil service job. Hitler, on the other hand, somewhat unrealistically desired to be an artist. Also during this time, he began increasingly to lose himself in fantasy. His narcissism ignited a burning passion for greatness as an artist or architect, but reality brought him failure after failure in this area. Each failure caused a graver wound to his narcissism and a deeper humiliation than the previous one. As his failures grew in number, he became more involved in his fantasy world, more resentful of others, more motivated for revenge, and more necrophilic. Hitler's terrible realization of his failure as an artist was blunted by the outbreak of World War I. His fierce ambition could now be channeled into being a great war hero fighting for his homeland. Although he was no great hero, he was a responsible, disciplined, and dutiful soldier. After the war, however, he experienced more failure. Not only had his beloved nation lost, but revolutionaries within Germany had attacked everything that was sacred to Hitler's reactionary nationalism, and they won. The victory of the revolutionaries gave Hitler's destructiveness its final and ineradicable form. Necrophilia does not simply refer to behavior, it pervades a person's entire character. And so it was with Hitler. After he came to power, he demanded that his enemies not merely surrender, but that they be annihilated as well. His necrophilia was expressed in his mania for destroying buildings and cities, his orders to kill defective people, his boredom, and his slaughter of millions of Jews. Another trait Hitler manifested was malignant narcissism. He was interested only in himself, his plans, and his ideology. His conviction that he could build a 1,000-year Reich shows an inflated sense of self-importance. He had no interest in anyone unless that person was of service to him. His relations to women lacked love and tenderness, he seemed to have used them solely for perverted personal pleasure, especially for voyeuristic satisfaction. According to Fromm's analysis, Hitler also possessed an incestuous symbiosis, manifested by his passionate devotion not to his real mother but to the Germanic race. Consistent with this trait, he also was sadomasochistic, withdrawn, and lacking in feelings of genuine love or compassion. All these characteristics, Fromm contended, did not make Hitler psychotic. They did, however, make him a sick and dangerous man. Insisting that people not see Hitler as inhuman, Fromm concluded his psychohistory with these words: any analysis that would distort Hitler's picture by depriving him of his humanity would only intensify the tendency to be blind to the potential Hitlers unless they wear horns.